you are comfortably zoned with the Zigzag Man in Alameda, California, pushing on the doors of life marked pull and fighting the Unholy Trinity as we go. Big business, organized religion, and government. Little Thelonious Monk to bring us on. Wonderful day in Alameda, California. I'm here with Brother Scott. Brother Scott, welcome back to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
All right. Last time you were here, we had the most interesting conversation about the minute differences between Democrats and Republicans. And we covered a number of presidents, but we left out just a few important ones. Let's talk about Truman, Kennedy, and Johnson. Brother Scott.
Well, to just recap, we had discussed how over the long term, the Democrats and the Republicans have traded places on some pivotal issues. You can go back to the American Civil War and remember that the Republican Party was the progressive party of its day. Abraham Lincoln was its candidate. They led a war against the institution of slavery, and the Democrats of those days were a pro-slavery party, by and large. And after the Civil War, the Democrats in the South were champions of Jim Crow, and that lasted for a century, thereabouts. Bringing it forward quickly, during the 20th century, the Democrats were the party of war, predominantly. That is to say that, beginning with World War I, the Democrats were in power. Wilson was the president, Woodrow Wilson. He was a Democrat. That was the war to end all wars, supposedly. And most historians, reputable historians today, will acknowledge that that was a war where all the belligerent nations, the Axis powers of Germany, Austria, and their allies, on one side, England, France, and the United States, Italy on the other side, were mainly fighting to carve up the rest of the world between themselves as colonial powers. And Germany was late to arrive in the age of modern industrial development and industrial capitalism. The German nation was late on the scene and wanted to be seated at the table, so to speak. But there was no room at the table for them. So there was a war. And it was a war of plunder on all sides. The characterizations of Germans as Huns and barbarians, and the German government and ruling elements characterizing the Allies in a similar light, it was wrong on both sides. And that was an atrocious war. It killed millions and millions of people with weapons of mass destruction. That included the introduction of aerial bombardments, tanks, heavy machine gun fire, and poison gas that was used by all the belligerent countries. On both sides of that war. That was a war which was led in the United States by the Democratic Party. World War II was a war that occurred when the Democratic Party was in power. And some would argue World War II was, underneath the political facade and underneath the rhetoric, was a war, again, an extension of World War I. Hitler was a bad guy, no doubt. Fascism was a horrible ideology, but that war more or less recapitulated the lines that were drawn in World War I, with some exceptions, and was fought for many of the same reasons. I'd point out, in fact, that Democrats in this country, some of the leading Democrats, in fact, were not anti-fascist at all. The name Joseph Kennedy comes to mind. He was considered an appeaser of fascism, and he advocated staying out of that war. Henry Ford was an admirer of Adolf Hitler. And there were other leading politicians in the Democratic Party who were not so hostile to the Fuhrer that they wanted to enter the war to fight him. At any rate, the Democrats were in power when that war was fought. In the Korean War, the Democrats were in power. Harry Truman was the president. That was a war to contain China, and an anti-communist crusade, so to speak. I would also point out that Harry Truman was the president at the very end of World War II, and he authorized the bombing with atomic weapons of the civilian centers in Japan of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, killing hundreds of thousands of civilians in one fell swoop. It was, by any reasonable and humane standard, a war crime. Japan was prostrate, ready to surrender, had very little fight left in it. And for those who would argue that the atomic bomb saved lives by ending the war more precipitously and more quickly, there are others, reputable historians, who would say that wasn't even the reason the bomb was dropped. If you wanted to demonstrate to the Japanese government what you could do to them at that stage, you could invite them to New Mexico to watch a nuclear bomb being dropped, or drop it offshore, or surround Japan with a blockade. The Japanese had sent signals through Sweden and other embassies that they were ready to surrender if they could come to agreeable terms. The best argument is that there was no need to drop those bombs to save American military lives, because American lives didn't have to be lost in the first place. Even if you just contained Japan, their power was broken. They couldn't continue the fight. So that was a Democratic Party-led effort at the end of World War II and at the beginning of the Korean War. And Jack Kennedy was in power when the Bay of Pigs happened in Cuba. It was a fiasco. It blew up in his face like a big Havana cigar, but it was ill-advised and for not a legitimate purpose, I would argue. Then comes Vietnam, and the Democrats again were in power when that war ratcheted up. And
Kennedy first.
Jack Kennedy was in power when that war first ratcheted up.
Right. Kennedy really served as a hawk in Vietnam. He had the interest of his beloved Catholic Church, and they were behind him. They wanted to go in there, and
there was a Catholic government ruling Vietnam at that time.
Right.
A largely Buddhist country.
Right, and they figured this is a great place to go in and try to make some inroads into increasing the populace of Christianity. And Kennedy owed the Catholic Church a tremendous debt for being elected. And I looked at him as a hawk in those days right away, and pretty soon Camelot was coming in to fictionalize everything.
You mean the myth of Camelot in the White House under the Kennedy administration?
It was horrible. We were led to believe that everything was so nice and rosy and peachy, and things were what they really weren't.
We all know better now.
We know better now. And
in fact, some have said that the Kennedys will go down in history as the people who used the mafia to run hookers through the White House in those days.
Well,
that doesn't have to be true, but that really was a common perception.
That really puts hookers in the bad light, the way you say it. But let's get on with it. He was no liberal. Kennedy was no liberal, and
if that's what you're looking for, you're right. He was no liberal.
He was no liberal, and Johnson was reputed to be less the liberal than Kennedy. But turns out that he had the political clout as a Dixie, what do they call them, Dixiecrats, to get the Equal Rights Amendment, Civil Rights Amendment, and the Equal Rights Amendment still hasn't really.
No, that's never happened.
That's never happened. That's another crow in my craw, or whatever they say. That really gets me having.
Well, let's be precise. What upsets us is that even under administrations that were Democratic Party administered administrations with Democratic Party majorities in Congress or the Senate, you couldn't get the government to pass a simple statement of equality between men and women as a constitutional amendment. All it was to say was that they would be treated equally, and it's never been stated or enacted into law at the federal level. No matter who was in power, Republicans or Democrats.
Although I must say, if there's one clearly distinct difference between the two parties, it's that the Democrats are more likely to be behind women's rights than the Republicans.
Currently. That wouldn't have been true back in the days of the Civil War.
That's true also.
Because the abolitionist movement...
Did you mention that Lincoln was a Republican?
I did. And the abolitionist movement, the movement to abolish slavery, which supported the northern effort in the Civil War to end slavery, had a large component of suffragists in it. Women's campaigners for women's equality also. The two movements were linked. And they were probably in those days Republican leaning.
Right. You know, independent of my influence, there have been a lot of angry women in my life that I see on a regular basis going through life. And they're angry for a reason. I mean, even before I came along, a lot of them were angry just because the 75% glass ceiling, all of these things, making 75% of what a man makes, I'd be angry too. And as a person who exchanged gender roles for a portion of my life when I was the stay-at-home dad, I appreciate the inequality that surrounded by a traditional gender role thing. When you're going through it, you're treated differently by all concerned. And so I've become somewhat of a feminist, if a man like me could be a feminist by any description. Whoops, the phone is ringing. Hey, we'll take a little break and then we'll get right back to it. All right, we are back with Brother Scott on Comfortably Zoned, Alameda, California, Tuesday before Thanksgiving, 2013, trying to clear up the end of the year. Brother Scott, let's clear up this episode and talk about Lyndon Baines Johnson.
He took power after Kennedy was assassinated. He was a powerful senator from Texas. And contrary to the stereotypes, he was one of the powerhouses that moved the Civil Rights Act forward. And, that's what he's known for, one of the things he's known for, but he also ratcheted up the war in Vietnam. I mean, it was a horrible fiasco. More weapons of mass destruction, like napalm, Agent Orange, things that are or ought to be illegal horrible deformities, major casualties. 1 million to 2 million people in Vietnam died as a result of that war, and Johnson was a principal leader in the effort to conquer the Vietnamese and bend them to our will. And that was the Democratic Party war for many, many, many years. Not that the Republicans wouldn't be behind it. I'm not trying to say the Democrats were worse than the Republicans. I'm trying to say that they don't deserve a lot of the credit given to them for being more progressive than they really are.
Right, and I think that today's president is a very good example. I haven't seen much change from back in the Bush days to now, healthcare notwithstanding, and a few niceties notwithstanding. We're still fighting a war in Afghanistan, which we're not out of. We've left Iraq totally in disemboweled, let's put it that way. Disarray, disemboweled. And who's going to pick up the cleanup for that? We will. Our government.
It's a Democratic Party president that's
right.
running the government while that war continues.
Right.
And yes, he's claimed that he's winding it down, but he's insisting on a treaty that allows American troops to remain for another decade after they're supposedly withdrawn.
And Guantanamo Bay is just going on the same as it was, torturing, waterboarding, the same as it was. That's a big disappointment.
Because Obama had said he would have it closed down within a year after taking office.
The first time he took office.
Right. 5 years ago.
5 years ago. So that's disappointing. Wiretapping, in a sense, I could understand. I've gotten a new, not understand totally, but I've gotten a new slant on things. You and I, Scott, Johnny Lunchbucket, all those folks out there, we have nothing to worry about. We really don't. They're not wiretapping us. They are specifically profiling. Now, they won't call it profiling, but they profile folks who have an interest in, a special interest in bringing down the United States of America for one way or another. And their computers are in tune not with what Scott and I are going to buy, have lunch, let's meet for lunch in Safeway. Ooh, they may be up to something. No. They're in tune with people who would attract attention. If you wanted to set up something, you're an amateur. Anybody listening to this is an amateur. If they wanted to set up, who do we listen to? Well, notwithstanding their personal freedom, which is another thing, and basically targeting a Muslim sector of folks who have a vested interest in our downfall. Now, can you blame them? On one level, we've imperialized their lives. We've tried to Christianize them, tried to change their religion. We've tried to make them adapt to the world as it is, to take their oil. And they're a little pissed.
We're wandering. I want to go back to Johnson.
All right. Well, no. Okay. Go. I want to talk about Obama. I want to talk about Obama and what's going on. All right.
And the wiretapping issue itself, we'll get to.
Okay.
We'll talk about Dianne Feinstein and others who want to increase the powers of the state to gather information and data mine and profile, as you say.
Yeah. What's Will Durst's great line about Dianne Feinstein? Do you remember?
She has no reason to be against gun control. If there had been gun control when Mayor Moscone was shot by Dan White, she never would have become mayor, and her political career never would have taken off the way it did.
Right.
That's
wasn't a very humorous line.
Clever, but not that funny.
No. A little scary, not funny.
But we'll talk about surveillance. That's a separate subject.
All right.
Suffice to say that the Democrats...
There's a Democrat behind it, and that's my
They're more or less united on that.
Right.
With some exceptions. But here's the point, going back to Johnson. He was driven out of office by popular discontent with the Vietnam War. He took office after Kennedy was assassinated.
Right.
Ran for election once. Could have run again, but decided not to because he was so wildly unpopular by that point. And
right.
The war was so untenable in Vietnam Everybody knew they were never going to win that war.
Well, actually, he took over for Kennedy in '63, but when it came time, yes, he did win. No, he didn't.
Johnson beat Barry Goldwater.
That's right.
He
right
ran
after
against Goldwater.
Right.
But he could have run for a second term.
And he decided not to.
And he decided not to, because he was very unpopular by then.
Right.
And deservedly so. And we could dwell on him, but the point is he was driven from office by popular discontent because the American population was fed up with his policy in Vietnam. And in large part, that's the reason why. So that was another example of where the Democrats led the country to war. We've gone with World War I, Democratic Party-led war. World War II, Democratic Party-led war. Whether you support that war or not, the fact is it was led by Democrats. Korea, led by Democrats. Vietnam, led by Democrats for the most part. Nixon was also involved in that at the tail end. He actually ended it. But then comes Carter. You mentioned Afghanistan, how we're still there. Carter got us involved in Afghanistan, and his Secretary of State, Zbigniew Brzezinski, got us involved in Vietnam, supporting the same type of people coming from the same milieu that morphed into the Taliban and Al-Qaeda years later. They were funded and led and guided, I should say, funded and guided and supported in other ways, armed by the United States. And they were the worst elements on the planet. They make women wear a veil from head to toe, and that's the last element you would want to support. They were fighting the Russians or the Soviets at the time, and regardless of what you may feel about the Soviets, you wouldn't want to have been a Soviet citizen and raise your hand in a political science class and say something impertinent, because it would cost you. But you know, if you went home to Tashkent or Tajikistan or Uzbekistan or Kazakhstan or any of the other stans that used to be part of the Soviet Union, you'd probably have a paved road and a storm drain and some electric lighting, and your sister could go to college and become an engineer or a doctor and could wear Western garb and lipstick and smoke cigarettes in public. You had that going for you. In Afghanistan, you had nothing like that. You had gravel roads, no airports, no railroad, no education for women. A murderous element was taking over, and they were aided and abetted in what was called Charlie Wilson's War, in the movie that was named after him, and was inaugurated on our part by Jimmy Carter and Zbigniew Brzezinski, and Jimmy Carter's self-righteous, misnamed Human Rights Crusade. And those were the allies in his Human Rights Crusade, the same people, same types of people who flew airplanes into the World Trade Center. My position is, if we had supported the Soviets when they were in Afghanistan at the time, we would all be better off now. The Afghans would certainly be better off. Does that mean we give a ringing endorsement to the Soviet regime? No. Does it mean that we prefer a Soviet-style regime to a Taliban-type regime? Yes. If you can't see your way to that, then you really need to rethink your political thought process. Because as bad as living under Stalinism can be, living under the Taliban and Al-Qaeda is exponentially worse in every regard that matters. So Carter got us involved in Afghanistan. And Republicans have also been involved in that sort of thing. But Carter also got us involved in Central America. He backed death squad regimes in El Salvador. If you saw the movie starring James Woods called Salvador, it's a melodramatic Hollywood depiction, but it's pretty accurate in many respects, and it gives you a sense of how nasty the Salvadoran government was and why the peasants in that country and others in that country rose up in revolt against them, and how the Carter administration supported that repressive death squad regime. My whole point in saying this is that the fundamentals between the Republicans and the Democrats are not so different at all. They're much more alike than they are different. And as my final word, I'll give you two illustrations. Joseph Lieberman left the Democratic Party. Right?
Right. Correct. Connecticut.
Right.
Senator
from Connecticut. he was too hawkish for his time, and he lost the Democratic primary because of that. So he ran again as an independent. And Arlen Specter, a senator from Pennsylvania, left the Republican Party and joined the Democrats. So the swinging saloon door is open. If you want to go from one club to the other, you just pay your dues to the other club, and you can sidle up to the bar and start drinking with those guys. Because in principle, there's not that much difference. If you want to affect change in this country, you don't do it by lobbying for Democrats or Republicans. You do it in the street, voting with your feet, letting your voice be heard, and you do it where you work, at the point of production. Because the government responds to that, whether it's Republicans in office, like Nixon, or Democrats in office, like Obama. And Obama, in many respects, is considered to the right, that is, more conservative than Dick Nixon was on certain social issues.
That is enough right there to sign out. Oh, wow.
For now.
Little scary. Thanks for clarifying it all, Scott, as usual. Brother Scott.
Opinion.
Well, one man's opinion who's highly educated and highly qualified to have an opinion. So I'm glad.
I'm just reading the papers.
Well, but at least you're reading. Let's put it that way. And you're reading all of the papers, and you're getting news from not just multiple sources, overseas sources, and Scott's a
right-wing press, left-wing press, mainstream press.
That's why you're such an additive, my friend. Hey, I'm going to sign out. I'm going to remind you to keep your dreams wet and keep your humor dry. Keep your kids away from military recruiting stations. And keep your kids off the laps of clerics wearing dresses. If you just did that, the whole family would feel so much better. And keep on keeping on. Adios.